Thank you all, as always, for continuing the conversation. My name is Yvette. I'm a student at CSUSB studying communication and environmental science. We don't have Marlo with us here today, but we're going to have a great conversation about community policing, and which we'll get into a little down the line. But first, like always, we're going to start off with our land acknowledgement. So I'll bring that up right now. Okay, so we recognize that California State University San Bernardino sits on the territory and ancestral land of the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians. We recognize that every member of the California State University San Bernardino community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1965. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold California State University San Bernardino more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. All right. And moving on, we're going to go ahead and get into our update for this week. And we've got a pretty great one. All right, so Alexandria, Kentucky Police Department has made significant progress in peaceful intervention and problem solving using not police officers, but social workers. Many of you may know that this is a form of community-based security which many have been advocating for, especially in light of the most recent tragedies as a result of police brutality. The move to social workers was a smart one all around. Louisville Metro Police Department service call records will show that among the most common calls made are mental health, domestic disturbances, and homelessness. These are situations which typically require intervention from social services and social workers who are trained and experienced in responding to these unique circumstances in all their complexity. Furthermore, a gross gap exists between the cost to the state for police officers and the cost to the state for social workers. An estimated max of $50,000 in savings is predicted when departments decide to hire on social workers rather than police officers. So that's just a little story that is pretty related to what we're going to be going into today with Dr. Gascón here at CSUSB. So thank you so much for joining us. Professor Gascón is a CSUSB alumnus. He earned a PhD in criminology, law, and society from UC Irvine, completed both his bachelor and master's in criminal justice at Cal State San Bernardino. The program is part of an ongoing, Well, we're gonna be going into this conversation with Professor Gascón. If you wanna go ahead and introduce yourself, doctor, and just give us all the 411 on what you've been doing and how you've been highlighting this conversation.
Sure. Thank you very much for the introduction. I appreciate the invitation. It's such an honor to be back at Cal State and to be sharing this work with all of you that's taken a lot of heart and soul to put together. So I wanted to share with you some new ideas I've been working on and building on the existing book project entitled Limits of Community Policing, Civilian Power, and Police Accountability in Black and Brown Los Angeles. This work focuses specifically, today, will focus specifically on the ways that racial meanings or understandings of race sort of become constructed or produced in meetings about crime in one area of Los Angeles. So the term that is used in the literature is known as race making. Typically, this denotes the ways that people define or reinforce or contest stereotypes or meanings about different racial categories and the ways that you treat and react towards them in certain social interactions. In a sense, it's about the social process of racialization in a broader sense. And you take the recent shooting of Jacob Blake, who was shot 7 times in the back while his children were present. because officers felt that he had a weapon and that they were in danger. This helps to sort of build on an existing conversation that is being had right now about the lack of attention and the lack of dignity that's afforded Black men in their interactions with police. Excuse me. And it also sort of reinforces the notion that Blackness is criminalized. You know, there's a lot of authors, race scholars and criminologists who have been building on this idea of the sort of legacy of criminalization of Blackness, sort of beginning from the beginnings of this country. At the same moment, in the same incident, you have Kyle Rittenhouse, a young white man who was a police cadet who shot 2 protesters in the wake of the Jacob Blake incident. And it wasn't until some time later that he was, you know, brought to police attention and was arrested as a result. And the distinction that I want to bring up here is the different ways that you conceive of Black men and white men in this moment, right? Whereas Black men become targets of justice, targets of police, and targets because they're perceived as dangerous and criminal. You have a white man who is actually involved in criminal behaviors in the street and taking the lives of innocent civilians, but yet his actions are tacitly defended because he's able to sort of evade capture for at least some time until the city government and the police department were under significant public pressure. And so I think this is important because it sort of speaks to this broader history of the relationship that we have between police, communities of color, and the ways that we understand race and in Southern California, but in Los Angeles in particular. And Los Angeles is important because it's very storied. You know, it has this long history of racial conflict, and the police department is often squarely at the center of all of these, or many of these incidents. You have here, for instance, 1982, LAPD Chief of Police Daryl Gates making comments about the death of James Mincy Jr. There was a lot of controversy about the police use of chokeholds at the time. There was a rash of incidents where Black men were killed in altercations with police or confrontations with police where the technique was used. And Daryl Gates here in this comment is sort of making very stigmatizing comments about the biology of Black men, right? Sort of faulting Black men for having weaker arteries than what he calls as quote unquote normal people, or what he might be tacitly saying or codedly saying white people, right? Or most other people. And this is just but one example, though. There are a number of others. He was famously the protege of Charlie Parker, who was probably the most well-known chief of police in Los Angeles history. But he himself was also known to make racist comments, blatantly racist comments that helped to sort of reinforce the notion that Black men were somehow other or less than or non-human. I mean, these comments go back to the 1960s about his reaction to the Watts riots, but it also goes back earlier in the 1950s when he came onto the department. He had similar comments about Mexican American people who were involved in the Zoot Suit riots. But I have other work that sort of speaks more directly to this history of rioting. I just wanted to bring this up because I feel like it sort of really depicts the relationship between police engagement in communities of color and how race sort of becomes understood, right? Racial stereotypes at least become understood. But while these examples are very clear and egregious, what I really want to understand is how you have these kinds of very blatant moments, but at the same time, you might have very subtle or hidden moments where race is being made, racial stereotypes are being produced or reinforced. And so some of you may be asking again, why focus on Los Angeles? Again, Los Angeles, the police department there is often at the center of policing debates nationally, and it's also a national leader in policing tactics, and has been historically. Historically, Los Angeles is also a large riot zone. You have two of the largest in US history took place in Los Angeles since the mid-century. And it is also a hotbed of racial conflict. We can talk about the Rodney King incidents, we could talk about all of the factors that sort of went into each of these riot incidents, but also smaller things like the killing of Latasha Harlan by a Korean shop owner, and a number of other interracial conflicts that we've seen in the city throughout its history. Why study community policing? So community policing is one of those terms, concepts that's not well understood, but yet police departments across the country tend to hang their reputations on this. They say that they are, like, you can't be a legitimate police department anymore without saying that you practice some form of community policing. It's by far the most prominent policing paradigm throughout the country and arguably throughout the West. I mean, if you include the UK and if you include some European countries as well. Latin America has adopted these strategies to a lesser extent, but there are examples in sort of North America. So like Mexico in particular has community policing programs, particularly in the largest cities. Lastly, why race making? I think that understanding race making is important because you want to understand the role that police have in shaping or reinforcing the racial order, the ways that people get along locally, the ideas that they have about one another, and how police can and do intervene in the relationships between groups of people in a particular neighborhood. And that'll be significant or become clearer in a moment. So this is the book I mentioned earlier. My collaborator and I, Aaron Roussell, spent 5 years doing ethnographic observations in one neighborhood that we call Lakeside in South LA. We took place between 2008 and 2013, and it pretty much spans the entirety of our graduate careers. We did most of this research on our own, self-funded, and supported one another through the thick and thin throughout the entire process. The book itself looks at the history of police and community relationships, look at the development of the program from the 1940s to the 1990s and even to the present. We also look at the development of Lakeside and how its demographic character and makeup changed, which I'll mention more, I'll discuss more in a moment. We also talk about the contemporary nature of crime prevention partnerships in Los Angeles. We look at the ways that meetings are organized, the number and the nature of the folks who come into these meetings. We look at how patrol is shaped as a result of this kind of engagement with the public. And we also look at leadership conflicts within the meeting and how that shapes relationships both within the department and with the department and other institutions and organizations in the community. Before I go any further, it might be important to understand and define what community policing is. Again, I mentioned that it's one of those things that's not very well understood, but there are some scholars who point out that there are some commonalities across the board. So first, most people recognize that community policing involves decentralized command structures. An example of this would be like those neighborhood police departments we see inside of a mall or you know, it's out in the community, something that's not part of the larger police department. That's an example, right? Those substations, or like the mobile substations that go to a park for a national night out program, for instance. All of those would be a form of decentralized command. Captains also involved in making decisions about deployment. That's also an example of decentralized command. At the same time, individual officers also have increased autonomy. They're empowered to use their own discretion about when and how to enforce the law. So you don't have to, I mean, there are guidelines about how to act in every situation, but officers here are afforded the sort of trust necessary to carry out law enforcement in the ways that the public in the local area feels it should. It also calls for improved communication between the public and the police department. Again, that could be through community meetings, that could be through, in Boston, they have this like blog, information blog. That's the ways that the public and the department exchange information quite a bit. But it's about sort of bringing these two groups together so they understand one another better. Part of the reason why police want to understand the public better is so that they can ensure that they're actually addressing the concerns that the public has. If police are enforcing, you know, funding all of this increased equipment and tactics for the gang unit, but the community doesn't have a gang problem, obviously their enforcement and the public's concerns are going to be out of step. So they want to ensure that the police departments want to ensure that they are taking the public's concerns and then turning them directly into enforcement practices. Part of the ways that they do that is by focusing on specific kinds of problems. They'll look for, they'll ask the public for, okay, tell me where you see graffiti problems, or tell me if there's a house that's where the squatters are living in, or is there a corner where there are young men out on a regular basis selling drugs, or could potentially be up to some other kind of issue. They're looking for specific problems that are chronic and recurrent, and they take place in a small set or like a regular area, regular location. Another goal of community policing is to build the public's capacity to prevent crime. So you want to not only make the public aware of what to look for, but what crime is, but also get them the information that they need to translate or to alert police. You know, many times people are either afraid of or don't know how to contact police to let them know of a given issue. They might not be sure whether to call 911 versus 311. So having a clear understanding about what those expectations are is one way to sort of build that capacity. At the same time, partnering again with groups so that you have a way of distributing the crime prevention potential in a given neighborhood. So not only would you want police officers involved in investigating and carrying out a particular enforcement action, but you want the public to maybe do some flyering or talk to neighbors and gather information. You know, it's a way for both groups to sort of work collaboratively towards the same end, right? To share or address mutual interests. All right, so if we look at the literature on policing in urban communities, one of the things that we find is that symbolic interactionists in particular look at the ways that organizational structure shape the nature of police-civilian relationships. There were a number of different studies, whether you look at domestic violence encounters, whether you look at the ways that police departments record crime data and communicate that crime data to the public, all of that is sort of geared towards reshaping the nature that police and community get along. One of the things that many symbolic interactionist researchers don't take very much account of is sort of the nature that race plays in sort of shaping that kind of relationship. What we do know by looking at Los Angeles, for instance, and looking at the broader history of race riots in this country is that race always has a profound impact on shaping racial organizations in the future. So anytime that you see huge sweeping reforms in police departments, not anytime, there are many cases historically when you see sweeping changes in a police department, and many times it has been the result of public discontentment with police actions. Many times it's a result of large race riot events. Many times it's a result of a police scandal. It all has to do with that sort of challenging and broken relationships, many times in urban areas in particular. The international studies that do look at not necessarily race centrally, but police-civilian partnerships really question the outcomes of these organizations. There is one of my mentors, Steve Herbert, looks at Seattle, and he really questions the capacity for community to carry out law enforcement functions. Many times people don't necessarily have the knowledge, the interest, or the time to go out and flyer and collect information for police or distribute information for police. You know, they might have a given concern at a moment right now, you know, a conflict with a neighbor or a conflict with some other group in the community, and they want police to take care of it now, but they can't necessarily commit a sustained effort over time. Lyons also looks historically at the development of community policing and sort of highlights how these kinds of changes have all been political. You know, many times organizational changes within departments have been made to make it appear as though to the public there have been substantive changes, but really the organizational structure of the department stays the same. You know, the message that they're putting out to the public, though, is something that is somewhat different. The work that I've done in the past to look at police-community relationships, or the work that, and with Aaron, looks at how even in police civilian partnerships specifically organized to translate or to identify the public's complaints and translate them into enforcement practices, there is a lot of politics and complications in that relationship. Yes, there are moments that the public and the police cooperate, but it's often when police already have a set practice available and the tools and equipment available and the manpower or the patrol resources available to carry out a given action. Whenever you don't have one of those things, when police don't feel like it's important, they don't translate that into action. And what that often results in is the public pushing back against the department, saying, you know, we have this need, why aren't you taking care of this? This is what these partnerships are supposed to be all about. So the central question that I pulled out, one thing that I hope to intervene into the literature with is how do joint problem-solving programs like community and civilian partnerships produce racial disparities in Lakeside? So one theoretical approach that I'm hoping or putting forward to help understand and address this question is this notion of team racialization. So I hope to build on interactional studies that have in the past looked at teams. Goffman's classic work on the asylums looks at how teams are social organizations. I mean, they're very purposeful. You know, they have a specific set of rules that define who is a leader, who is a committee member, and the different set of responsibilities that everybody has in that moment. There are necessarily power differentials in those kinds of relationships, right? Where a leader has much more responsibility and an ability to dictate what others can do, whereas other members might be subject to that person's power, right? These are relatively straightforward sort of sociological ways of thinking about the nature of a team. Previous studies that have looked at how police and community work together as teams, again, point out how there is a huge power differential, something I was just mentioning a moment ago. But while a lot of that happens inside the meeting room when you're having exchanges about what, you know, deciding about what is an important crime issue and what isn't, what happens outside in patrol ends up becoming or having a huge, what am I trying to say? Are a reflection of broader structural concerns that have to do with racial inequality, that have to do with economic inequality, and it shapes the ways that officers approach certain kinds of people in the public. So if they come upon someone who they see as dangerous or might be up to no good in the community, or someone who's homeless in a shopping center who they assume don't have the ability to sort of patronize any of those businesses, they're going to treat that person differently. Right, and a lot of these patrol and enforcement decisions are going to be based on the kinds of conversations that they have in meetings. Racialization scholars point out how, in order to really understand how race works in these kinds of interactions, to understand how race is sort of made and created in this team fashion, you have to look at how racial structures, the ways that they're produced, the social actions that produce them, and the relationships that facilitate their reproduction, how all of those feed into the creation of inequality or the reproductions of inequality, right? The ways that stereotypes are produced, or the stigma that is attached to certain bodies based on racial beliefs about their racial identification. And building on Amanda Lewis's work, who looks at racialization in schools in California, I hope to look at how, to build on her ideas on how racialization plays out. She talks about how the process of racialization, how it's made, is carried out by specific agents who are people who are, again, encountering others, assigning them a racial category or labeling them with certain beliefs about a race, and then interacting with them based on their beliefs about that person, how they should interact. In order to really give you a sense for how this is all important, you really have to take a look at the community that I'm dealing with here. So the Lakeside Division is not necessarily a neighborhood or a community in the ways that a lot of people talk about it. It is one cohesive thing because the department has designated it a policing division. You know, because the ways that the department, right now the department is set up into 23 police divisions across the entire city. And this is, and each of them are designated by the population within it. So sometimes the geographic area is going to be much larger than others, just depending on the density of that area. This so happens to be one of the densest in the entire city. While it used to be the heart of Black LA, now it's significantly a mixed area of Black and Latino neighborhoods. Sometimes you see Black and Latino families living right next door. Sometimes there are entire blocks that are Black. Sometimes they're entirely Latino. It just depends where you are in that particular neighborhood. This area was settled primarily in, the first Black population to arrive was in the 1940s. And by the 1950s, it was sort of broadly recognized as the Black Belt of Los Angeles. But really by the 1980s, Central American migration as a result of civil wars really changed the demographic character of this area. It had a significant impact on relationships there as well. As a result, today, tensions run extremely high between the two groups. In the community, you have a lot of conflict as a result of because this used to be the Black Belt of Los Angeles, there's a lot of resentment towards in-migrating Latinos. Black families often feel that Latinos are sort of taking over. They have these very negative attitudes about what they perceive as numerous families cramming into a single home. They feel that there are so few jobs in the area, but they feel that they're being passed, that young people, even at jobs like McDonald's, get passed over. Young Black people, excuse me, the Black families that I spoke to feel that when there are jobs available at places like McDonald's, young Black people, young men and women at high school age, college age, often get passed over by older Latino adults because they're seen as more reliable. They don't have as many school commitments, for instance, so they can afford to spend more time at work or work different hours, right? They just have more open availability. That's the perception. On the part of Latinos, the perception is that the Black public is to be feared. The perception among many Latinos there is that Black gang members will sort of prey upon them, and they don't feel comfortable talking to police because they feel like exposing themselves to police might then make them vulnerable to deportation and family disruption and other kinds of things like that. So there's an immense amount of fear in the Latino community with engaging with Blacks. At the same time, both of these attitudes are often held by the adults who are often at working age, 40s, 50s. Young people tend to be a little bit more open about mixing, but because we're dealing in these meetings with mostly adults, I mean, I wanted to highlight some of those attitudes. The worst expressions of the conflicts in Los Angeles between Blacks and Latinos are things like gang-motivated violence. I mean, you take, for instance, the killing of Cheryl Green in 2008. That's probably one of the worst examples, or the firebombing of a Black family in Hawaiian Gardens. So these are just sort of examples of the interracial tension that you see in that part of town. But the racial tensions that you see now were boiling in 1992, and not only as a result of the Rodney King riots, but of other things like I mentioned before, the shooting of Natasha Harlins, the complex relationships that Korean shop owners have with the Black public or the Black community in South LA. All of these kinds of things really came to a head in that moment when the riot was taking place, or breaking out, I should say. So this is a representation of, I don't know if, is this blocking this? This is a representation of some things that I was mentioning last time that I was here. This is a graph that shows sort of the different kinds of policies that emerged from the different riot reports after riots had taken place. So you have here, for example, the Zoot Suit riots in 1943, the Watts riots in 1965, and the Rodney King riots in 1992. And it shows, where in the city they took place and who were the commissioners. But the most important thing for us to what happened here? The most important thing for us to see here in this are these four rows. These four rows speak to the four pillars of liberal police reform as discussed in Alex Vitale's The End of Policing. So he talks about how, in that work, he talks about how the evolution of policing in the contemporary period have all been along these four dimensions. Like they've all come up as a result, or many times the commissions and the reports that have been made suggestions about police reform have all been made along these four dimensions. Incorporating new education and training, having an increased diversity, having a workforce that is more diverse, more oversight and accountability of the department and its actions by the public and other government agencies, and generally an improved relationship with the community. Some of the commonalities that you see are an increase in, for instance, in the 1943, there's new education, you see racial sensitivity, mostly because, again, this is conflicts with Mexican Americans, and you see some of the same kinds of training that is being implemented in 1965 as a result of the riot in the Black community. And then, again, when you see increased workforce diversity, you see that across the board. There is a suggestion to diversify the workforce along these different lines. First, racial, and then towards the end of the century, towards the end of the last century, they also include gender and sexuality in terms of diversity. Oversight is something that improved or became more robust as the century wore on, but every one of the reports sort of spoke to the need for improved community relations, but they were different in what they suggested. At first, the programs were much more oriented towards youth and creating these interracial councils. Towards the end, it was about expanding existing programs in the department and improving upon them. So there was really no huge transformation in the ways that police operations were being had. It was, again, especially in 1965 and 1992, it was really just refashioning the same old police practices that had been used. And when we talk about in the book, some specific policy language that is actually rejuvenated. And that word, rejuvenation in policy language, is actually in a lot of the LAPD archives that we looked at. These patterns in the four pillars of police reform, if you look at riots throughout history across the country, you see some of the same exact patterns. And this is the Harlem riots in 1943 in the first column. In 1968, between 1965 and 1968, there was a whole rash of riots in numerous cities around the country. And the Kerner Commission report of that year does a very, very sweeping, comprehensive report about all of those incidents at once. So it's by far the most comprehensive report that we've seen on riots to date. And then the last is the Ferguson report in 2015. And again, you see some very remarkably similar reforms. So there's not really been a whole lot of significant revolution in police reform as a result. Many times you see a lot of the same structures, a lot of the same leadership in charge of implementing these kinds of reforms. So when you really get a sense for both the suggestions and the structure of the department that is being asked to reshape as a result of these incidents, you start to see why not a whole lot of change was made over time. Now, on to present day. The meetings look like this. There are English and Spanish meetings. Most residents, most meetings are probably between 15 to 20 residents, but you also get larger meetings that are up to 30. Most officers who show up, senior lead officers, there's typically 2 in the Spanish meeting and maybe up to 5 or more in the English meeting, again, depending on the nature of a meeting in a given month. Sometimes there might be a special event going on and that might call for additional officers. But there's typically only one captain who's overseeing all community policing activities in the division. Note about methods. This particular data set draws on only the 2 years in the early part of fieldwork. There were observations or field notes that I collected while I was observing public safety meetings, park events. I mean, these were things like Easter Day events, a movie in the parks, carnivals. We went to municipal court hearings for street vendors, and other citywide events that were organized largely by the police and other government agencies. I also conducted interviews with police and community stakeholders to help sort of contextualize the conversations that I was observing in these meetings. And I also consulted a body of LAPD archives that were given to Aaron and me by both a mentor at Irvine who had a relationship with LAPD, and also we collected these documents from LAPD officials while we were in the field. And so I used MaxQDA coding software to analyze all of the data once I input it into the computer. And I used the coding process as spelled out by Emerson, Fretz, and Shaw. It's a 2-stage iterative process. So I open coded everything exhaustively and to try and get as many ideas as I could. And then I went back through and highlighted some of the more recurring themes and tried to find relationships between them. And I did that over and over so that I built an entire data set out of them. Now, some of the challenges that I confronted in the field had to do with the role that I played while I was in the department and in the community. For the most part, when I acknowledged or when I introduced myself as a student researcher, people were often very curious. They would ask questions about why I wanted to do research at that particular place, why I thought these issues were important. But for the most part, it was like a novelty. Most people really welcomed my presence. However, being Latino and being in a community that, as I've mentioned, there with quite a bit of interracial conflict, my position as a researcher was somewhat challenged when I tried to do interviews with Black residents about vending issues or about issues that spoke to their relationships with Latinos. For the most part, I mean, my relationships with Black residents in general was very good. I mean, there were many occasions when participants would invite both myself and Aaron over to their homes or to barbecues or funerals, even things like that. So it wasn't that I had a bad relationship with anyone. It was just that many times Black residents wouldn't be as forthcoming. They wouldn't tell me what they would tell Aaron because they felt less safe around me, or they felt like maybe they couldn't tell me that they disliked a particular Latino neighbor or that they didn't have a great relationship with them. At the same time, that came up when I was doing interviews with police, asking questions about particularly white officers, asking questions about their relationships with Black and Latino communities, conducting investigations there. There were these very visible reactions on the part of police officers when I was asking questions or in the field. The last, though, was both a sort of a resource and a hindrance in the field. There were, because at the time, I was about, 23, 24, and because I'm Latino, that just so happens to be the same exact profile as most LAPD officers. I think it's like more than 50% are Latino males between the ages of 25 and like 35 or something. So I fit the profile perfectly. But when I was also walking around with my white research partner, we just so happened to look like 2 buddy cops in a movie. And this film in particular, End of Watch, was being filmed in this same neighborhood at the same time. So this kind of image of these 2 cops together was something that informed a lot of the ways that residents saw the both of us. For police officers, that worked fine. You know, they often didn't even acknowledge my presence because they just assumed that I was supposed to be in a given space. But some residents felt uncomfortable, particularly when I was asking about issues, or particularly when I was conducting research on gang conflict. And that's another area of research, and I could speak to that a little more if people have questions about it. At the same time, despite those challenges, I found ways to overcome them. With the working with Aaron, you know, we found a way to sort of do a division of labor in data collection, so to sort of facilitate the process. You know, because he had limitations in speaking Spanish, I took over a lot of the data collection there. And when it became clear that it was a problem to conduct interviews with Black residents, Aaron took those over. Those are some examples of strategies that we did, but there are a number of others that we employed. Ethnography itself was a very productive method for this kind of project. It was a very flexible method. Again, I mentioned it was almost completely self-funded for most of the research. It also resulted in very rich and situated data because we were there for so long in one place with the same residents. We got to really know people, the community, and their problems, and the relationships with police. Not only that, but because I was in the department for so long and had good relationships with not only residents, but with the police and the leadership there, I was able to collect information to help triangulate some of these findings. So not only observations, but also interviews, and then again, archival data to help sort of situate what I was observing within the institutional context. So this is what I will focus on today. I'll look first at what LAPD documents say and what they're, in terms of defining how they're going to map the neighborhood, how they're going to understand the criminal or the crime control priorities of that particular neighborhood. And then I'll also talk about the ways that residents fought back against or argued against being defined as a crime control priority. So first, LAPD documents talk about how they define the set of practices and also the language that they will use to help map the problems in the community. So they're really using this terminology, mapping, as a metaphor to sort of, literally in the sense of developing a crime map, but also mapping as a metaphor to sort of understand the nature of crime, its distribution, and how best to sort of address it using both police and community resources. The senior lead officers will be in charge of really becoming the experts of the area that they patrolled. You know, they were given a census tract within the division, or a number of different census tracts, and then that would be their area. They were supposed to be controlling that environment largely on their own. And civilians, again, would come into meetings, register complaints, and that process would happen over and over again. And through that, police believe that there would be this sort of mutual understanding about the nature of crime and ways to enforce it in the community. The public would register complaints. The next month, an officer would report what they had done based on that complaint, and then that process would hopefully resolve the problems that are being raised in meetings. So one of the first crime control priorities that came up, one of the most common, was what residents and officers refer to as illegal or unlicensed street vending. Since 2018, 19, I want to say street vending has been decriminalized or legalized. Now it's under a different set of regulations. Although I've not been on the ground to see how policing is any different in the current context, but on the books, there's supposed to be like a decriminalized attitude towards vending. But at the time that I was collecting this information, a lot of Black residents pointed this out as a significant problem. There was one resident, as you could see, this so happened to be the CPAB president, the president of the English meeting. And she was arguing that illegal vending had gone way beyond the rule of law. She complained that she had moved away from Los Angeles, and when she came back, the community had been inundated with vendors that hadn't been there before. The local shopping centers that had been Black-owned businesses all now had vendors like the ones you see here on the right, sort of lined up along the sidewalk, and that had presented a lot of problems for members of the public. Another English meeting member argued that when vendors were coming through the neighborhoods, that they would create a sort of they would have a sort of undesirable presence. You know, she complained about the noise that they made, the kind of food that they were selling, and again, was arguing that they had broken the law, and was trying to direct police attention towards these kinds of activities. And in the last, Ms. Mayfield, another member in the same meeting, she was complaining that again, the kinds of foods that vendors are selling, whether it's pork rinds, whether it's ice cream, and sometimes it was like soup that they argued were these kinds of things were not only unsanitary, but they were causing a congestion whenever they were around particularly large and busy shopping centers, and it was sort of problematic. And not only that, but they were kind of eyesores for members of the public. So after a number of these complaints, one of the senior lead officers responded. Right? He organized a task force with the Department of Health, and they confiscated a number of carts and either arrested or ticketed the vendors who were involved. People who they labeled as chronic offenders. A lot of the folks who had come back again to the same kinds of areas. Those folks were arrested in addition to being cited. So one of the things that I forgot to mention here is that vending was a very racialized issue. So you had vendors who tended to be Latino in this neighborhood, who tended to be primarily Latino immigrants working as street vendors. And the complainants tended to be elderly Black community members who were homeowners, sometimes business owners, but these were folks who had been in the community a long time and were reacting to something that they saw as like a new unwanted presence. At the same time, because of what I mentioned earlier about Latino fears in the community, this was something police recognized. They recognized that many Latinos in the community were not really willing to work with the police. They were not really willing to call the police for help because they feared that police might somehow transfer the information to a federal immigration agency, and then that might facilitate their removal from the United States. So they wanted to avoid a lot of that. But at one point, one of the SLOs read a policy memo out aloud. And you can see here in the language that it is sort of very antiquated. This is only from 1979, but here you can even see Gates talking about the alien status, right? I don't remember when immigrants became aliens, but there you have it. This is sort of the language that was used to try and assuage people's fears. You know, the department isn't really looking at immigration status. We only want to collect information about crime. That's what the department was trying to stress over and over again. This became an emphasis for the department, particularly when you saw a rise in certain kinds of crimes. Whenever you saw a rise in bus stop robberies in particular, that's when officers started to really get the word out to the public. One of the captains in the meetings would say, "Get to know your SLO, get them information, you know, about the incidents that you see." Have them exchange information with them, have them, you know, give you what they know from their recent patrols, and build a relationship with them, even if you don't come to meetings. And another SLO who was giving a presentation in a meeting was sort of talking about how in a recent operation that she had been involved in, she took the mobile substation out to one of the bus stops and started to hand out flyers to a lot of Latina mothers who were at the bus stop. And she argued that it was many of the same people that you see as victims in these cases. And she was giving them this counseling. She was saying, stand up strong, keep your head on a swivel, hide your gold chains, hide your purses, you know, don't make yourself a victim. You know, they're trying to get the public much more aware of their surroundings so that they can change their behavior and maybe reduce the likelihood that they become victims. So the bus stop robbery issue was racialized in the opposite direction, right? So Latino victims or Latinos were more often the complainants of bus stop robberies in meetings, and the presumed perpetrators were Black. One senior lead officer here in her experience was talking about how this is exactly what she saw, right? It was Black gang members who specifically targeted Latino workers at bus stops because they saw them as easy targets, because they assumed that immigrants would be afraid to contact police even when they had been victimized. And the leader of the Spanish meeting took particular exception to this. And it was on a number of occasions that he had that he really took the captain to task for not prioritizing this over others. In the end of that particular confrontation, the captain asked the leader, Mr. Mendoza, to get other members of the public involved. This should be the kind of activity that draws more Latino participants into the meeting so that they can learn how to protect themselves. I learned later, the closer I got to Mr. Mendoza, who he took a liking to me because he's Central American, he's from El Salvador, and he grew up not far from where my family is from in El Salvador. When I spoke to him, we met in a Guatemalan restaurant near downtown, and he was explaining to me that part of the reason why he was upset was because his mother had been attacked in a similar incident. Right? She was leaving or on her way to work in the morning, and then suddenly she got robbed and was injured in the process. Right? And she felt that the assailant had attacked her because she was a woman, and because she was vulnerable, and because she appeared to be not paying attention to her surroundings. In general, I mean, while the gang member robber terminology was somewhat coded, even though it was not necessarily, even though it was clear that everybody who used those terms was talking about Black perpetrators, Latino residents tended to use a wide range of very blatant racial terms when they talked about Blacks in the community. They talked about negros, they talked about mayates, they talked about callejeros and drogadictos and all of this. And these are all the wide range of terms that they use, but very, very blatant and criminalized language. This is in contrast to the ways that Black residents talked about vendors, right? They made very sure never to talk about Latino, Mexican, Central American vendors. It was just vendors, or it was people who were causing a nuisance, right? It was very sort of legalistic terminology as opposed to very racial terms. And similarly to the vendor case, here again is an example of one of the senior lead officers reporting that they had been involved in a task force and that it had been very productive. That they had made a number of arrests and they hope to continue to make arrests in similar investigations. Let me skip past some of this. So in the end, what I find is that police community meetings produce really the shared understanding of both the nature of crime, the distribution of crime, but also at the same time, the nature of the local racial order. The ways that the meetings were set up, they helped to not only define the specific roles, the relationships that police had with members of the public, but also how certain complaints become translated into enforcement. They learned that there were a lot of limitations to that process. Not everything did translate from a complaint to enforcement, but certain things like vendors, like robberies, did merit police enforcement in a lot of ways. And part of this, again, this reveals that sort of power differential that you see in these kinds of meetings. With meetings that are supposed to be premised on partnership, that are supposed to be premised on equality, that are supposed to be premised on democracy, you still see a significant power differential between the two groups. They're not meeting on the same playing field. It's clear here because police are not only sanctioning, but silencing certain complaints as less important than others. And why do I think that this is important? I think this is important because it reveals that, again, the Black and Latino groups are definitely engaged in interracial conflict as a result of the evolution of this community. They use racial language in different ways. But again, it's also that the police and the public are sort of collaborating to act as racializing agents. And they're working together to create and reinforce racial boundaries that exist in the community as it is. At the same time, I'll skip over this because I wanted to, I didn't go over that in the findings. Another thing I'll mention briefly is about my own role and what I think this says about similar studies that have happened recently. Scholars of color are more and more often studying criminal justice institutions. These images on the right sort of are looking at, are images of books that my colleagues have written, and all of them to some degree talk about the challenges that they confronted because of their race and gender identity in criminal justice settings. And I feel like the more that researchers researchers of color particularly go into heavily policed and criminal justice environments, the more this is going to happen. So we need to begin to build a repository of strategies to help sort of overcome the challenges that we see in the field. To some degree, these kinds of challenges are going to be are ever present. They're not going to go anywhere, but I think the smarter we are about what they look like, the smarter we are about how they come up, the better we'll be able to collect data in the field, and we won't have our research projects challenged as a result. In terms of future directions, where do I want to go from here? I think I still am very much interested in looking at issues of race and policing, but I want to pivot. Rather than looking at groups of color any longer, I think it's important to also understand how whites and whiteness sort of fit into this discussion. And I want to look back at particular cases, most often inspired by some recent events. So the Kyle Rittenhouse case in Wisconsin, for instance, where he evaded capture for some days until the public put a lot of pressure on the department to act. Similarly, the two killers of Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia, right? They escaped any kind of public or legal scrutiny for several weeks until public groups, community groups were putting significant pressure on the city government to act. In both of those cases, the city government actually did act under a lot of pressure. But in specific instances, like in the case of mass shooters, you see that there are many cases where mass shooters come into contact with police, but yet somehow evade capture and then eventually end up perpetrating a significant act of extreme violence. And I really want to understand why that is. And I think that there are theories and perspectives that help to clarify and understand what's going on. One of the most influential so far has been this notion of racial halo effect that Ron Weitzer talks about. And I hope to understand and clarify how these kinds of practices can, or how this case of racialization is working in police investigations as well. I wanted to acknowledge all of the groups that helped me get here, the folks that helped shape me at UC Irvine, those who helped shape me thereafter, and then all of the networks that I've been working with as a result, or since leaving graduate school, and particularly this group of scholars here at the bottom right, who have been my comrades in sort of developing this field of critical police studies that we all are very much interested in. I realize I didn't get to police reform, but I'm happy to talk about that if y'all have questions about it. But thank you very much. How do I end this?
Sorry, I was on mute, everyone. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Gascón. I was on mute, but I wanted to thank you for giving us that in-depth look at community policing. I also wanted to remind everyone to go ahead and engage with our Q&A section here to go ahead and ask any questions you might have of Dr. Gascón. We have Stan Futch here with us, who's president of the Western Action Committee, and he has been on with us a couple times before, as you all know. Glad that you are here to join us on the conversation again. We have some questions here that I'm gonna send towards you all. First, we have Sharice asking, isn't the public somewhat reluctant to contact police during this climate? Aren't they more afraid more than anything right now?
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I think there's a lot of people who will be more likely to avoid police contact at the moment. But you'd be surprised. I mean, there's a group here in Boston who still regularly meets, not only with the police department, but also members of federal agencies to talk about crime in my neighborhood. You know, and I live in Roxbury. It's a neighborhood, not too dissimilar from some neighborhoods in South LA, but it's like a mostly Black and Latino area. And it is still very much, there's still a lot of participation in meetings like that. I mean, I think there are young people who are involved in research or in activism who are very much dissuaded to participate in these kinds of meetings. But then there are others, homeowners, business owners, folks who are still very much invested, have quote unquote stakes in the community. Those folks are still very much likely to contact and work with police.
Yeah, Dr. Gascón, I have a lot of questions, but in your research, I saw a lot of Black on brown, and I guess what my question is does community policing work? And if it works, was one of the issues the Black on brown more collective of information as opposed to getting to know the community?
So you're asking if it works to gather information about the public?
No, I was asking you, was it community policing, or was it community information collecting?
I mean, yeah, I think it's the latter. I think, you know, for one, nobody really knows what community policing is. I mean, even the people who do the research don't really have a solid understanding. The one that I gave you earlier is a meta definition that comes from a lot of different research. The information that the department solicits in these kinds of meetings is often one way. It's like they only want to use it for their own purposes. They don't necessarily get to know the public. In the degree that they do get to know the public, it's only so far as they care about, if that makes sense. It's like, okay, yes, Mrs. Johnson, you have complaints about your Latino neighbors, but we can't really do anything about certain of your complaints. You have complaints about vendors who are breaking the law, that's something we can act on. If you're complaining about parking issues, if you're complaining about something else, you know, that's on you. You have to deal with that. That's not necessarily learning about the community. You know, that's only sort of that's only using the same tools that police have always had.
Thank you.
You're muted.
Sorry, I'm trying to maneuver all functions on one screen. So we have a question here from Daisy, who wants to know, why doesn't the police do the same thing that Starbucks did, which was closing down to do training on diversity? They want to know, how would police reform look like, and will police officers be trained?
What if they close to do trainings on diversity? I mean, I think, for one, LAPD's training curriculum is a national model. They're widely recognized as having one of the most robust training curriculums around the country. But even so, you know, the discussions that you have about diversity are so, they're not very practical. You know, most police training, here in the state of Massachusetts, I'm on this board that evaluates police boot camps, essentially, and to see how well they match up with curriculums at college, you know, college curriculums with respect to criminal justice and policing. And anytime that you see discussions of diversity or cultural sensitivity or issues like that, you know, it's often an afterthought. They do have the training. They do have the discussions in the boot camp, but it's not given the same weight. It's not given the same seriousness as an officer learning how to fire a gun, how to apply a chokehold, or how to put a set of handcuffs on. It's very clear where the emphasis is still going, despite the fact that that kind of training does exist. And to the question about Starbucks, I mean, I tell you what, just, was it a few, I can't remember if it was 2013 or 14, the NYPD went on strike, and they believed that crime was going to shoot through the roof, and it was going to make the public clamor for more police. Well, it kind of fired back in their face, because crime statistics stayed level, and in fact they went down in a lot of areas because there was no officers there to arrest. But it didn't have the kind of impact that they thought it would have. So if police departments decided to shut down and do diversity training, that might have some kind of an impact in terms of getting the public or letting the public know that the department is taking it seriously. But one training, closing the department for one day to do one training is not going to have a long-term effect. You need to have continuing education. You need to have much more of an emphasis on specific kinds of training that officers should get with respect to how to treat, as you were mentioning earlier, Yvette, how to deal with mental health issues, how to deal with people in different crises and emergency situations, having an ability to speak more languages than one in a community. Here in Boston, for instance, East Boston is a primarily Salvadoran community. Someone please explain to me why almost every single officer in that community is Irish or Italian, and they do not speak Spanish. And I think it's a fundamental tool to be able to speak and communicate to your community. And that community, like every time I go there, there's no English spoken. There is no English spoken. So I don't know how these officers are doing it on a day-to-day. Diversity training at the base level is something that needs to happen all the time. And it needs to be emphasized much more heavily in boot camps.
And I would also add, Daniel, to your comments in terms of diversity training for police officers. I have been in situations where I have offered my services and have not been welcome. I think they see it as, anecdotal, of course, but I have heard that and read that police officers as a group do not see this as something that is necessary. And what I would suggest is that if white communities are not complaining about how police officers act in their community, it's obviously not training that is needed. It is weeding out the racists, weeding out people who have racist attitudes about the communities in which they serve.
Yeah, that's right. And there's a movie about the Oakland Police Department called The Force that came out a few years ago. And in it, one of those most striking scenes is there's he's a black pastor from Oakland who was involved in, they basically gave him a time slot in the boot camp. And he would talk about the history of slavery. He would talk about contemporary race relations, all from this sort of Oakland perspective. By the end of the film, he was leading a protest against the police department because officers were not taking to the training. They were not taking it seriously. The very same abuses that were taking place before his involvement were taking place after his involvement. So that just goes to show that you're right, Mary. People have to be willing to accept this kind of training and accept it as a reality and accept it as important, as something that they should be employing in their enforcement of the law on a day-to-day basis.
I have to jump in with a question as well to speak to Mary's point. We have already had speakers come on and confirm that from their findings as well, whenever we do have some sort of a training about racial sensitivity or diversity in police departments, that it actually results in increased incidences, maybe because of contention. And I wonder if the same pattern is found in officers who participate in things like the community meetings that community members attend, and what have your findings been about how effective it might be for community members who are really suffering from circumstances to come to those meetings and actually talk to police officers? Has that been effective in a positive way at all?
It depends on what the issue is.
Mm-hmm.
It depends on what the issue is. If a resident complains about speeding in front of the high school, the officers will say, well, we can put a speed box there. When we find out what time people are speeding the most, we'll put a patrol there, and then we'll start giving tickets and making arrests if necessary. If you go there and you talk about there's squatters next door, they're using drugs on my lawn, and they're threatening my kids and drinking, blah, blah, blah. You know, unless there's something extremely violent in that community, unless there's something extremely violent going on with those neighbors, there's not much of a chance officers are going to show up. That's also part of the problem in that community and in a lot of urban settings, is that police are called to so many different incidents that they're being spread so thin that there's not much of a chance that they can get to a lot of issues anyway. And I think that kind of contributes to, there was Victor Rios in his book Punish calls it the over policing, under policing paradox that exists in a lot of urban communities, where people feel like they're more likely to be subject to police contact or police scrutiny than they are to receive police service, and it's because of not only the negative perceptions that police have of people in a given community, but it's also because of the resources or the lack thereof that exists in urban settings. I don't know if that answers.
Professor Gascón, I'm sorry, I have a question from one of our audience members. She writes, please speak to the recent removal of gang stats in LA because they were so inaccurate.
The removal of gang stats. I'm assuming that this person means the Cal Gang database.
Yes.
I believe so.
Yeah, that's pretty huge. You know, I think that there was a lot of organizations speaking out against the use of the Cal Gang, because most of the people in that system were either Black or brown. It was like 200,000 people. Most of them were young men from the LA area, and being registered in that database had a significant impact on your life and your contact with police thereafter. If you were in a car with someone who you weren't even driving, that just because you're in the car and you might be an identified gang member, all of a sudden everybody else in that car is going to be listed as an associate in the Cal Gang database. There's little kids, 4, 5, 6, 7 years old, listed in the Cal Gang database as associates. It was completely overused. I think the initial intent was to help facilitate or was to help police officials and government officials sort of understand the size and scope of the gang problem, and then easily translate or easily distribute information to other agencies, mostly federal. But the effect that it's had is just, it's sort of contributed to over-policing, it's contributed to mass incarceration, and it's contributed to the stigmatization of Black and brown men in communities all over California.
Could I go on about that too? Also in Florida last election, they used exactly that to steal thousands of votes. And that was in the Black and brown community. They tagged all these people who were voting as gang members, and by the time they cleared their names, the election was over. And so that's another thing that was happening, and that's happening with that kind of collection of information. But I did want to touch on something. One of the things that you talked about was how admired LAPD is. And I know, if you take away the riots, take away the 2 riots, and just look at the problems LAPD has had over the years, I have always questioned, why do other departments think LAPD is so well trained and so far advanced to every other department in the country? And they do, and I don't understand it.
If you talk to LAPD officers and you talk to officers in other cities, they'll talk about the most unexpected reasons. Like they'll talk about how sharp the uniforms look compared to theirs. They'll talk about how like, you know, everybody kind of looks the same, and the appearance of the officers is very clean cut, and the language that they use is like a very, very professional. And it's not often about, you know, the record of leadership and this and that and the kind of collars, but also because historically LAPD has had this crime fighter image, and that is like, I mean, I wanted to be a police officer when I was a kid. And the crime fighter image was one of the things that really attracted me to the profession. I think as I grew older, I started to see the world a little bit differently. You know, that dream went out the window. But I think for a lot of people who do want to pursue careers in the justice system and in policing in particular, that belief, that image, LAPD is the gold standard of that.
And I think I would also add that, and just piggybacking on what you just said, Daniel, LAPD has had more press, more positive press, more television shows. The very first cop show on television that had a national audience was Dragnet. And, you know, we've talked about in this space before how the Chief Parker, William Parker, actually locked up the badge that was shown. He had it in a safe in his office. So before every week before they filmed the show, he would, you know, take this, you know, go through this ritual of taking this badge out of the safe and, you know, having them bring it back, and he had to approve all the scripts. So when you can write your own PR, you know, you're going to come out looking pretty good. And, you know, so we've had all these cop shows. And in fact, in LA Times this morning, there was an article on how the PR in police departments kind of, you know, they shape the narrative. They can, you know, and reporters, you know, not doing their jobs correctly, go to police officers as, you know, the end all to be all. And you know, they don't necessarily get all sides of the story.
Absolutely, I think that's absolutely right. There's a really good book by a Berkeley political science professor. It's about police and democracy, but he has a whole chapter on the relationship between Chief Parker and Joe Friday. I can't remember the name of the actor. Do you remember, Mary, the name of the actor on that show on Dragnet?
Jack Webb.
Oh, Jack Webb. So Jack Webb,
right.
He had a close personal relationship with Chief Parker. Yeah. Chief Parker gave him access to a lot of his leadership, and it's part of the reason why that show was so close to reality. And it was very much in that book that professor talks about how it was very much Parker's intention to use that show as a PR machine. You're absolutely right.
You sure did, yeah.
Professor Gascón, I wanted to ask if, I know that community policing has been compared to counterinsurgency. I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Yeah, part of the reason why, and I don't know whether everyone is aware of the sort of military roots of community policing, but I think that's very true. The reason is, and I wasn't aware of this until I was actually in the field and met an LAPD officer who was on his way to Afghanistan to teach troops community policing tactics. The reason why there's a relationship between military operations in the Middle East and domestic policing in the States is because they use the same kinds of activities. They would go into a community, they would try and understand the relationship between the quote unquote terrorist group and the public. They try to see how close they were, hold community meetings, promise favors to the public in exchange for information about the targets of a military operation. And then they would slowly sow divisions between the folks who they saw as targets and everybody else who they put in the sort of general public category. Having flyering campaigns, community meetings, messaging like see something, say something, keep your head on a swivel, like all of those kinds of tactics were very much the same things that were being used in Middle Eastern war zones at the same time that they're being used here. It's not clear to me anyway, at what point there became an association, but by the 90s and 2000s, it was already firmly in place.
Okay, we have another question from an audience, Tasha Thomas. She asks, has your research addressed whether it is more beneficial to have law enforcement that are Black and Latino have more of a presence in those communities? I assume communities of color, or does that create more of a problem?
It depends. I mean, research shown that doesn't matter what race the officer is, they'll all identify as blue. I mean, there's that scene in Boys in the Hood where there's the Black officer who was much more aggressive towards Ice Cube and Cuba Gooding Jr. and all those guys. That is a reflection of reality for a lot of people in South LA. There's a research done by, and one of the papers that I put up in my literature review actually looks at the difference of what they call substantive versus symbolic representation. So symbolic representation is like just having more Black and Latino and gay officers and women officers, right? And having it just be the same, numerically the same number of, or the same proportion of officers on the force as there are in the community. But then they contrast that with substantive representation, which is having those same folks in positions of leadership and to be able to make decisions that are actually going to reflect on the ground. The latter, when you have more substantive leadership, there is a greater impact. The department tends to be a little bit more responsive. But on the street, depending on the neighborhood, there are a lot of officers who share the same racial background as the person that they're confronting, will act the same way, will be just as or more harsh, or will be more punitive in stops, whether it's likelihood, whether it's their demeanor during the stop. They might be more abrasive, they might be rude, they might be more likely to sanction them, and they might be more abusive. But there's been research to show that just because you have more officers of color doesn't necessarily change the way that that they're going to be policing. There has to be changes within the organization itself to sort of define what different roles they play.
And that goes back to what Mary was saying, is the change has to be eliminating racism, period, because you talked about 50% of the officers are Latino, and that's a huge number. And so you would think that would make a major difference in the Latin community as far as the crime levels and so on and so on. And they see their peers every day in uniform. You would think that would benefit them and minimize and reduce the crime in those areas, but it's not.
But it really speaks to the instability, the lack of definition, or the flexibility of what it means to be Latino. If you are fifth generation Latino and you speak only Spanish, you're going to identify as American, and you're not going to respond to racial commonality, as opposed to someone whose parents are immigrants and they're working in an immigrant community. That's going to be a much different relationship, right? Those kinds of differences, native born versus foreign born, immigrant versus, those kinds of things do bear out in research. Wesley Scogan, another of the pieces that I was referencing earlier, he looks at Chicago and talks about how Latinos there, it depends on where they fit along that continuum. If they're native born, they tend to have a relationship that's more akin to white communities. They trust them more, they're more likely to have their complaints turned into enforcement, and they're more likely to go to meetings. Foreign-born Latinos have a relationship that's more akin to the Black population in Chicago. Much more contested, they talk about abuse, they're much less likely to go to meetings, and they don't trust officers as much. So I think I think in order to really understand how Latinidad shapes LAPD, you have to understand where officers identify along that continuum as well, because that's going to be an important distinction.
And that leads to one of the questions. Anonymous attendee asked the question, is it possible that the community meeting increases racial stereotypes and tensions within the police department because they led to greater policing and criminalization of activities associated with certain ethnic and racial groups? If so, are there any ways to avoid this combat? And I gotta say something before you answer, because I believe that a lot of community policing is getting churches, community organizations, and the neighborhoods together to collect information more so than it is to solve. Would you answer the question, please?
I think, I'm sorry, can you say the question?
Is it possible that the community meetings increase racial stereotypes and tensions within the police department? Go ahead.
That is one thing that we found, yeah, that racial divisions tend to be worsened in this context. I think that there are ways to smooth them over, but the police department wasn't very good at it. Part of the problem was simple things like intergroup communication. You know, you have a community that's rapidly changing. The Black settled population is having this. The older groups are having this very negative reaction to people who are in-migrating. And so those complaints exist, they're part of the social fabric of the community. When you go to a place where those complaints can become police action, yeah, the intergroup tensions become worsened. We saw a lot of that in just trying to create one meeting. Part of the reason why you have an English and a Spanish meeting in Lakeside is because the two groups couldn't make it work. The police department tried in these very limited ways to bring the two groups together, but because there were breakdowns in communication, different levels of understanding of the system of government and laws in the United States, different levels of education, different levels of sort of ownership and stake in the community. All of those things serve to drive the public apart. And the department only said, okay, well, we couldn't make it work together, and then we just got to separate them, and that's fine. And also, leadership conflicts, members of the public really contributed to that. The CPAP president who was the first quote that I gave today on street vendors, she had a lot of conflict with Mr. Mendoza. The two of them they had a significant hand in shaping the intergroup dynamics in those meetings. You know, had they been different kinds of figures, people who were more likely to work together and had an interest in bringing Black and Latino groups together, maybe that would have worked out differently. But they had a lot of animosity, and I think that sort of facilitated those divisions. So it wasn't just what police did or didn't do, it was also what the public was bringing into the meetings itself.
Dr. Gascón, I was wondering, could you give like a brief overview of what takes place at these meetings and who shows up? Is it primarily members of the business community or just normal citizens?
The English meetings are pretty scripted. There is an agenda that comes out. The captain will typically open up with some of the broader community level crime issues, talk about changes over time, and compare them to significant points of the year. The summer months, obviously, there was like a swell of crime, so the captain had a lot to talk about. After that, each of the SLOs would show up. Most of the time they did, sometimes they didn't though, but they would give their updates about their specific area. You know, if they were in charge of 2 or 3 census tracts, you know, they would talk about elevated levels of prostitution or drug sales. And another community was like trash dumping and shoplifting, and another one, it was robberies and other kinds of things. So the SLOs would talk about, you know, their unique issues, how they handled them, or what they were doing to try and address them. After that, it was often guests of the group who would come in and speak. Sometimes it was like the director of the park who was trying to invite members to some kind of programming that was happening, or a church official who there was going to be like a candlelight vigil for a recent death. Or there was like a lowrider group that was having like some kind of charitable event. You know, those kinds of guests would come in and speak. The last portion would be the public complaint portion. So that's when everybody would sort of talk about what specific issues they wanted to have addressed. The Spanish meetings were much more loosey-goosey. You know, they had this much more like educational tone. It was like a combination of the officers talking about what they've seen in the community in the last month, but also explaining, you know, this is what happens when you have a 911 call. If you don't have an emergency, this is the kind of call you should make. If you're trying to get graffiti taken down, then you might want to call the city. You know, it was things like that. So it was much more funneling people toward the relevant agencies. Whereas the other group, it was much more, it was much more structured. There were subcommittees that was in charge in organizing events. They were doing like community outreach, all kinds of different organizational. There was just much more development in the English meeting, I should say.
Do you think that the differences in the way that those meetings were developed were necessary, or do you think that they were maybe an oversimplified approach to maybe a problem that the leaders were not equipped to address in a sensitive and effective way?
I mean, I think the two meetings, by the time that we came along, were a reflection of the department just trying to make do, right? The English meeting was recognized as the official meeting. And that was the one if the chief of police, if an FBI agent, or if a leader from another law enforcement agency around town was going to come to a meeting to speak, it was going to be at the English meeting. The Spanish meeting, if they had guests, it was typically a Spanish-speaking officer from another community who, they found some reason to present something new to the public. It was, again, very educational. I think they were just, I don't think that they were making this decision saying, Black folks are obviously more politically inclined, so let's make them, let's give them the more organized meeting. And Latinos need to, I don't think it was necessarily intentional like that. I just think that's kind of how it ended up, because that's what the public felt was most productive. That's what the police found was most productive for them at that moment. I don't think the department was very good or had very much interest in bringing the public together and making it work, because it was going to be hugely challenging.
I think Linwood's. I mean, was it Linwood?
Lakeside.
Lakeside. I'm sorry, Lakeside. I think it's similar to where I grew up, and one of the issues was the same thing. It turned from a African American neighborhood to a Latino neighborhood, and it gradually, and then what the African Americans were saying is, when you sell your house, if it's possible, try to find a Black buyer. And it was that way, and then it got to be us versus them, but then it became just sheer numbers, and the numbers in the African American community weren't there. We can't hold our neighborhood because our kids are graduating, they're going away to college, they're going away to work, and so on. And the numbers just weren't there, so it got to where they're here. Let's work with them and be their friend, and so in my old neighborhood, there's some kind of come together thing going on, and it's sad that couldn't happen in Lakeside, because I think one of the problems when you start separating the meetings, you're also separating the people.
Exactly. Yeah, it had a sort of divide and conquer effect, because even though members of the public had very similar complaints about the lack or the inaction on the part of police based on some kind of complaints, you never know that they have this shared interest, this shared frustration, because they don't see eye to eye. And that I felt was the most disheartening part, because it was like these are supposed to be meetings where the public can hold police accountable, but that's not, most of the meetings are being controlled by police from get. Very rarely, in those moments when the public is trying to hold police accountable, they kind of sweep that person aside. That's just that complaining lady, or that's not really our job. They had all of these different ways to sort of deflect responsibility in those kinds of instances.
I wanted to ask a little bit about something that one of our speakers, when Alex Vitale was on, what he kind of kept on redirecting the audience to, which was the big role that the distribution of money and the budget of a city plays in kind of the spikes in police brutality that we do or don't see. And if you could just speak to our audience a little bit about that, about city funding, state funding, how we can participate in deciding where it goes. Yeah.
I think the best way to get involved in sort of reshaping or funneling how the city is deciding where money should go is really just to get in touch with representatives and make sure that they're aware that this is something that the public is interested in. You know, here in Boston, there are a number of activist groups who are forming coalitions, and they're going to city council meetings, and they're going to police community meetings, and they're going to all of these small government organizational bodies to make small local changes that are going to have hopefully a large impact. And like here, and then also pushing for having leaders in the community push for police reform. There is a community in Boston called Brookline. It's a very wealthy white community. It's where Tom Bradley, what's his name? I'm not a football person.
Brady.
Tom Brady is where he used to live, right? Just to give you a sense of the scale there. In that community, you know, they're having this big conversation about police reform at the moment. And it's activist groups, it's professors, and it's local leaders who are all involved in trying to move that discussion forward and trying to reshape the city budget so that it doesn't all go to police, that it doesn't all go to criminal justice, and it does go more to education, to social services, and to other areas that are sorely needed in the community.
Professor Gascón, I was wondering, could you describe the experience of conducting the ride-alongs with the officers, and what was that dynamic like?
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, it was fine. It was very rigid, though. You know, you could tell that officers weren't sort of accustomed to having someone look over their shoulder. Some officers made a kind of I used to carry, especially in the early part of the field work, I would have my notebook out. And I would be sort of like very openly taking notes, and then at one point an officer kind of made it very clear that he thought it was a problem. He was like, "Oh, you take copious notes." And so afterwards, I kind of put my pen aside and I stopped taking notes, and I just started to I just started to sort of have an easy breezy conversation with the officers during ride-alongs, and I think that helped to sort of make it seem like it was like they were less so under observation and I was more trying to learn. I think also putting myself in a position to remind officers that I was a student, I think also made them feel better. But yeah, depending on the race of the officer, it could be a really uncomfortable ride. There were some white officers who just, well, I don't know if I was Latino, I don't know if it was because I was a student or just someone who wasn't a police officer, but they just were not very trusting at all and was like stone-faced the entire time. But then there were other officers who, you know, immigrants, they're speaking mostly Spanish growing up. They had a very similar upbringing and were very jovial and got along really well. Some Black officers are the same, you know, but it just really depended on the person. But I learned a lot about what to do and what not to do on those ride-alongs.
I have to ask, as we're already on the topic, just what perspective of the community did you get from the different officers that you encountered? What perspective did you get depending on their own background and their own biases that you might have picked up on in your interviews?
I mean, I think most officers have this very black and white vision of the world, vision of the community, where they separated into law-abiding community members, and that was like the people who called police, the people who show up to meetings, and the churchgoers. And then there was everybody else that they were suspicious of. And that was mostly like young people, homeless, prostitutes, potential or like perceived gang members and drug dealers, right? They had this very cut and dry, you know, often in a ride along, it was like, oh, that person's up to no good. Let's turn back around. And officers would be very aggressive when they have these kinds of perceptions. So like once there was like a laundromat and there was a guy outside. It had just closed. I think it was about 11 at night. It had just closed, and the lights were shutting down as we were rolling by, but there was a guy sitting out front on his cell phone. And the officer thought it was suspicious. Why the hell is this guy out front here, you know, in this neighborhood? So he pulled over, put the lights in his face, and then had this very aggressive conversation with him over the loudspeaker. You know, like that, I'm not sure that would happen in Brentwood. I'm not sure that would happen in Beverly Hills. You know, I think the officers felt emboldened to do things like that because the neighborhood has a history of being rough, and because the people in that person's past, the people that they confronted on the street, you know, this person just happened to remind them of that. But the race of the officer didn't have a whole lot to do with it. You know, again, I saw Black officers engage in behaviors that I would characterize as a little bit aggressive. Same thing with Latino officers and then white officers too. So it just like I said before, I think there was always an element of officers identifying as blue, seeing themselves as enforcers of the law first, and as people's behaviors as fitting into either a criminal or non-criminal category. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, African-American parents have a issue with their young Black sons and nephews and so on. And one of the things they have to do to tell them is, you know, here's the rule of law when you go out in your car and you drive down the road, and you have to do this and you have to do this and you have to do this. So one of the anonymous asked a question, and it is, where did it go? Oh,
I think it's the last one, Stan. The last question all the way down.
Yeah, there it is. Okay, what would be the best source of lawful information that I should keep at home or in my car that I can refer to if I ever get stopped unlawfully by an officer? I don't have the best memory, so remembering all of the right things to say in such a stressful situation is unlikely. I want to be able to stand up for myself and prove to the officer that I'm not disobeying.
Absolutely. You know, the ACLU puts out these little card-sized like guides on how to interact with police. And they have them for regular domestic police interactions, and they also have them specifically for immigrants and migrants who might contact federal law enforcement agencies. And it specifically says, you know, what rights you have in that moment, how you should communicate, and how you can hope for the most you know, favorable or advantageous outcome. And those things are small, something you can put in your wallet. So, you know, if you don't want to remember your Bill of Rights, then you can at least have this in your wallet or in your car to remind you of things to do. So there are resources out there like that for sure. And that's something that I share with my students a lot. You know, we have a unit on police violence and abuse. And that's one of the things we talk about, how we especially as students of color, you know, my students here are a mix of mostly Black and Latino. And that's one of the things that we talk about is, you know, how to manage a situation with a police officer so that you don't come off as suspicious, so that you don't alert them to anything. But it is also like it's a tough conversation to have, because I think some people are understandably just frustrated that they become suspect just by being who they are, right? By doing seemingly innocuous things on a day-to-day basis.
And I would also add, and I don't think you would disagree with this, Daniel, that when you're stopped at 2 a.m. by a police officer, that is not the time to assert your rights. Depending on who you are, but you know, there is this belief among police officers that we are the authority in the neighborhood, and we need to be obeyed without question, almost like a parent-child relationship. It's very paternalistic. And, you know, this also gets to the point you were making a few minutes ago, and that is, or you implied that the discretionary power of policing. This is one of the most discretionary professions in the world, because, you know, especially when it comes to drugs or things that are, you know, or sex work or whatever. You know, I have, as a police officer, I have the power to say you go to jail or you don't go to jail. I have the power to put your name in a gang file, which will have profound effects and for your whole life, unless you spend a whole lot of money to get your name off of that gang file. But it is so discretionary. You know, we give these people this unbelievable power, the power of life and death. And yet we pay them, and they don't seem to be doing what we ask them to do in our communities.
Yep, that's absolutely right. I do agree with that.
I assume Aaron is African-American, your partner?
He's white. He
He's
grew
white,
up.
okay. So you weren't working with an African-American. So when, oh, okay. The reason why I asked is because you were talking about information you were getting from, Aaron was getting and you were getting. Sometimes Aaron would get the information and you wouldn't be able to get it, and vice versa.
It was typically only in the case of Latino-focused issues during interviews, but otherwise there was really no problem. But yeah, Aaron had a close relationship with a few of the participants because he grew up in Virginia in a primarily Black neighborhood, and there was a few other Southerners, and I don't know, they shared some experience about cooking or culture. I don't know, but they shared a lot of things like that in their background.
Yeah, that's okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Professor Gascón, I understand that in one of the first iterations of your book, you included information about the LA Rangers, which were basically white Anglo vigilantes who expropriated land and participated in extrajudicial killings. I was wondering, what was the reason not to include that information?
Oh, okay. I tell you what, the history chapter, I wish that could have been an entire book. I think when we were drafting that book or that chapter, we wanted to go to the origins of the department, but because it was a book about community policing, we thought it best to sort of focus on the origins of the liberal reform process as it related to police and community issues. So that to us was the early period of the civil rights era, and the sort of the adoption at a federal level of a lot of community-based strategies, not just as a result, not just related to policing, but a lot of other things. So that was part of the reason. But I wish we could have talked about. There was so much we wanted to talk about there.
But
yeah.
LA had the goon squad, didn't they?
Say what?
LA had the goon squad, didn't they? And there was a bunch of white officers that went around, and the original putting together was to keep the mafia out of LA. But when they had successfully done that, they turned to the Latinos.
That was more in the 1930s. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. It was, and so their history. That's an amazing history, and because like I said, they went from the mafia to a certain people. They went to the Latinos and said, we got nothing else to do. Let's go get them. And they would beat up the Latins on Fridays and Saturday nights.
Yeah, they were, and the Rangers go back to like the 1850s, and it's sort of around the time of the conquest of the Southwest, really. And I think that's part of a really, really interesting history of policing in the Southwest that's not well understood, that's not well explored. That's something that I hope to do in the future. Is to sort of is to do like a revisionist history of policing, because often the histories of police that are most well recognized in the literature start with Boston, the establishment of Boston as the first police department in the country, based primarily on the principles set out by Robert Peel in London. Right? He's like famed for establishing the first police department in the world. But it really is to the exclusion of police organizations like slave patrols in the South, and it doesn't really talk about the LA Rangers. It doesn't really talk about vigilante groups that serve policing functions in the Southwest. So I think that is something that's ripe for research. That's definitely something that people need to look more closely at, for sure.
Sure. Well, we look forward to seeing what you have to say on that in the future, and whatever research you can turn up in any of the subjects that you have touched on with us, because they've all been very interesting, extremely enlightening. I really want to go ahead and turn it over to our guests and everyone on for any final comments. Any final comments from yourself, Dr. Gascón?
No, I thank you very much again for having me and inviting me. It's been a real pleasure, and I'm glad that after so many years I can come back to Cal State and just, I don't know, tell you about things, tell you how things have gone.
So glad to have you here.